Hello, welcome to the ActualTech Media Expert Series. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from ActualTech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event on choosing your next firewall, key features, and decision points. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that come in. That Q&A panel is also the place to just say hello, which a lot of you have been doing already. We love to hear where you're logging in from, and it's also the place to let us know if we can help in the unlikely event you have any technical issues. A browser refresh will fix most issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we will provide further technical assistance. At the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. You just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Now, these Expert Series events are special product-neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field. But the support of our sponsors makes it possible for us to bring you this content. So we want to give a special shout out to our sponsor today. In a moment, I'm going to share a message from CrowdStrike, and that message will refer to links that you can find in the handout section of your console at any time during the presentation. And as always, the handout section also has a few valuable ActualTech Media links in it as well. There's a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to ActualTech Media's great printed resources on technology topics. There's also a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, including another Expert Series event next Friday on ransomware. Now, before we get into the main presentation, a few words from our sponsor. We are supported by CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike helps you streamline your security operations, simplify security, and its protection evolves. CrowdStrike stops breaches. CrowdStrike has a free trial for viewers today. Click on your link in the handout section to sign up for the CrowdStrike Falcon trial, which includes Firewall Management, Next Generation Antivirus, Device Control, and Threat Intelligence. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Evgeny Karam. Now, Evgeny will tell you a little bit about himself as well, but I'll just say that he's got deep cybersecurity experience from being a cybersecurity engineer with the Israeli Navy to a firewall QA engineer at Check Point to a long career at the Herjavec Group, where he ended up as a vice president of cybersecurity solutions architecture. His current passion, the Security Architecture Podcast, is an excellent source of interviews and information with thought leaders in the security space. There's a link in your handouts as well where you can go to check it out. So we are in great hands to hear about key features and decision points for choosing your next firewall. I'm going to turn things over to Evgeny.
Hello everyone, I'm Evgeny. I'm very happy to be back and talking about Negation Firewalls. I spent a lot of time working with firewalls for the last 20 years. Check Point, Cisco's, Fortinet, Palo Alto's, and Juniper's as well. Very eager to talk to you and present on the history of the firewalls, what happened with the industry right now, where we are, and definitely what are the important points to choose a new firewall. Let me share my screen and we'll go from there. Great. So firewalls are here to stay. I know people not talking perimeter is everywhere. There is no more perimeter. True in some cases, but there's a different type of firewalls, and we're going to talk about all of them. And I'm very eager to hear your questions and answer them later on as well. So let's begin. First of all, I want to talk about myself quickly and my partner Dimitri. As part of our regular job, we also have a podcast called Security Architecture Podcast, where we review vendors and what they do and what kind of problems they solve. Both me and Dimitri have a lot of experience in the industry on different levels, so we gather our knowledge, not just in theory, in practical, working with customers, working with vendors, working with real case scenarios. So happy to be here again. Let's dive in and see what we're going to talk about today. This is the short agenda for today. We're going to talk about firewalls definitely, where they are, do we actually need them, the history, how to choose one, what to look forward, and stuff like that. Let's dive in. So, do we really need a firewall in 2022? And I'll say yes, because if you look on a slide, how many different locations we have here that potentially need a security control. And not just potentially, they need a security control. We definitely have our data center that protect our environment, that protect the data centers. In many cases, it could be the service and the information that it's a enterprise security for the company, or corporate security, or it could be customer-facing service and applications that still need to be protected, and we need to understand who can access and who cannot access the information there. And firewalls made a big leap from just simple security controls to do many, many more things like UTM, Next Gen, DDoS, URL filtering, and many other things. We're going to talk about all of them as well. We have the public cloud. We may don't call them firewalls, maybe call them security groups, but in a sense, they're still firewalls, just called differently, still protect, still create rule base. We have a branch offices where we need to protect people to connect back to the environment or connect to the internet. We have our business partners that we want to make sure the communication to them is secure and not wide open. And we, of course, have our laptops and workstations where we also need a firewall, a bit different one, but still a firewall. Let's jump in, talk about history, because I personally very strongly believe that to understand the present, you need to go back and understand what happened. So this is a very, very quick observation on the history and network security for the last 20 years. You will see many different features there. And you may say, is this a firewall? And in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. In reality, majority of the features and the tools you see here in one way or another are incorporated right now in the new firewall. Maybe not same, even so many new firewall vendors or existing firewall vendors that have been a lot of time on the market have their version of the same as well. If we go back in time, 20, 30 years ago, the traditional network looked like this. No firewall, wide open. Very, very quickly changed with the help of Cisco Checkpoint, where we introduced a stateful firewall, where we not just have everything wide open, but we have a firewall that understand connection, TCP/IP, understand what goes out, to remember in a NAT table, in a firewall table, what can come in back. This is how Checkpoint started and made quite a lot of money in the beginning, and many other companies, Cisco, Juniper, later on Palo, that took their steps and also brought it to a different level. It was the beginning, but of course, as everything in cybersecurity, it's not just stopping there. It moved on. Very quickly, it moved to something else. But before we go there, I want to just bring some fun statistics. This is 1997. Think about the speed. We are talking right now about 10 megabits per second. This is the firewall discussion we had back in these days. So your phone, my Android phone, can probably run faster than a firewall in 1997 and probably do much more right now. I mean, majority of the cases, many of us in North America have a gig connection to the internet. And it's much, much faster than some of the offices in this time. But let's go back to the firewalls. We very quickly move to unified threat management. We know there's IPS, intrusion detection prevention, intrusion detection and prevention. We have URL filtering that started as an idea to, actually it was a mandate to schools to block pornography for students and then evolved to do many other things. So UTM decided, okay, why to have 3 different appliances? I can have all the functionality in one box. It was the idea. It wasn't in parallel. It was more in a serial mode. So we saw a lot of slowness and degradation in performance in such appliances. And of course, more innovation came with the improvement of CPUs, Intel, i6, and the hardware to be much faster. What also happened is applications evolved, but the firewalls not really. Many companies realize that port 80 is pretty much always open and for free later on. So if they want to do update on their application or like Skype get out, they don't want to create their own port. They just want to use port 80. So very quickly, majority of the application switch to use HTTP, HTTPS to get out. But the firewall was just accepting everything. Palo was actually one of the first one that introduced the idea of application control, where I not just open a port, but I also understand what is the application that's getting out and what's happening with it. So it's on port 80, you're going to have different signatures in a way to understand if it's a Skype, Messenger, or something else. And this was the beginning of the next generation firewall, as we call it right now. Application security is one. I understand applications, and later on, I'm building on top of it of sanctioned, unsanctioned applications, and many other things. The second part, because of majority of the internet decided to use encryption to be secure, and not everybody see what we're doing, we need to open SSL. If we're not open SSL, we're going to be blind to inspect what's happening inside the tunnel. A lot of talk right now about TLS 3 and what's going to happen there, because the way it's going to do the encryption will change and it's going to be much harder to understand URLs. We're not fully there, but we're very close. But in reality right now, pretty much majority of the internet is SSL. So if I'm not decrypting SSL, I'm going to be in a big trouble. And it's an important point when you choose a firewall, because with SSL decryption, I'm basically become main in the middle for the firewall for outbound communication to the internet. I need performance. And the bigger the key that encrypt the information, when you click on this lock on the URL, it will show you the size of the key. It started as 1K, majority of them right now around 2K, and some of them moving to 4K. The bigger the key of encryption, the more performance degradation you're going to have on the firewall. So think about this, because it's important, and that's why load testing, something we will discuss later on, is fundamental for very big enterprises. The next part that is fundamental to next generation firewall is user identification. We moved a long way from just creating rules based on source IP or network. I need to understand that Evgeny is Evgeny. If my office has 7 floors and Evgeny decided to move every hour to a different floor, I cannot create rules for Evgeny for every floor based on network. I want to create rules for Evgeny based on Evgeny. So if Evgeny moves from HR to IT to marketing to development every hour, the firewall will be able to communicate with the directory services, LDAP, Active Directory, to understand it's Evgeny, and the rule base will remain the same. I will not automatically will get rules of marketing because I'm in a marketing effort right now, because I'm part of my group in Active Directory. Are going to have rules that are associated to me. It's a very important concept. Unfortunately, still companies in some cases don't use it fully, and I personally believe it's very fundamental and important when you move to use next generation firewalls. And these components are important as a package. Application, SSL decryption, user identification. Of course, we want it to be done in parallel. We want it to be done fast. We don't want to wait for this. This is just an example of what you see. This is a packet that decrypted, and I can actually see that this is Evgeny, this is scan, what is the destination, where is it going, what's the port, and a lot of information about the person. This is in majority of the cases. In some of the vendors, they will show the information because we understand who is the person and where is it going. So now we move to this magical box called Next Gen Firewalls that encapsulated with itself a lot of add-ons. And the add-ons could be URL filtering, intrusion prevention, DNS security as well right now, SSL inspection, threat prevention. I can actually download threat information to understand to what hashes are going through the firewall, where are you going, to have dynamic categories to block information to malicious website to maybe newly created domains. And all this should be as part of your POC process for your success criteria. Success criteria is a fundamental and important part of you choosing a new device, especially the firewall. Some fun statistics right now. Remember the 10 megabits in 97? This is some of the SMB devices for some of the major brands. Look on the speed right now. We're talking about gigs, not megs, gigs. So the hardware experiences, the manufacturers didn't stop as they keep pushing the performance of the firewalls and the ability. But you also may see that different numbers represent different things. SSL VPN, for example, or threat prevention is usually lower than the firewall throughput because I need to encrypt the traffic, because I need to manipulate the traffic. So when you understanding the firewall you want to buy, you need to look on all the numbers, not just on the number for the firewall. You also want to understand how many interfaces the firewall will have, not just connectivity, I mean inside your company. You're going to have an internet, you're going to have a DMZ, you're going to have a LAN, and all the traffic between them is also calculated for the throughput. So there is a calculation that need to be done to understand the device you want to buy that will serve you for everything, because certain months potentially will be a higher performance, like a holidays, for example, and certain months less. So you don't want to get to the point when your regular performance is 5% CPU, but then on the very big months you get into like 95% CPU. You want you to sleep better at night and not worry about it. Let's go to shopping list. So what do I care about the firewall? We spoke about throughput, and we spoke about SSL inspections, that it will degrade it. We talk about add-ons. So I basically, as a fundamentally, buy a firewall, I buy a hardware box or software box that its size by the throughput. This is the fundamental part. But on top of this, I may buy addons, URL categorization, DNS security, feeds. All this is going to be extra money depending on the vendor. They may choose it differently. And then I have a replacement for the hardware and support as well, and potentially some other services. Because a firewall is an inline network device, I want to understand my network capabilities as well. Can I do QoS? Can it be part of my routing if I do dynamic routing internally? How's clustering working? Because high availability is fundamental as well. And you may hear me say it's fundamental a lot, because firewalls is a critical component in every infrastructure. By being a firewall engineer for many years, I got my fair share of criticism on, oh, we did this, you guys made a change on the firewall and everything went down. Everybody always blamed the firewall guy or the firewall itself. And because firewall are fundamental and in the middle of everything, and there's a lot of changes happening on the firewalls, you want to make sure high availability is working, redundancy is working, link redundancy is working as well if you're using multiple interfaces for links and switches. Last part, but important part as well, is how easy is to use it. Maybe the firewall is very robust, but the GUI and the UI is not. We moved away for a long time to editing firewalls in the console. Sorry, all the friends and people that actually still use it on Cisco's potentially. There are so many different changes and there are so many different things that need to come to account that you need to have an interface. You don't want to add rule number 5 and then realize you cannot remove it because you need to delete all the rules before. So the UI, the simplicity of the UI, the understanding of the UI, it's very important. And don't forget, just add rules. You need to remove rules as well. The ideal life cycle of application is you adding an application right now, and in a year, 2 years, you know that when the application is EOL or done, end of life, you can also remove it as well. We don't want a messy firewall rules. We have compliance to have. We also have a half of the firewall. We want a clean rule base with explanation of what's happening. We also want login on the firewalls because, unfortunately, troubleshooting is part of our work as well. We also want to have API connectivity. Maybe you want to connect the firewall to other devices to create some automated responses. So it needs to have some kind of API connectivity as well. And the last one, what are the metrics for the firewall? We'll talk about it in the end. Let's go and talk about different types of firewalls. So we have the data center firewalls. This is the firewalls that are usually the bigger firewalls. They are the most robust from fail tolerance perspective. In many cases, there are the chassis with different cards, and there's hardware redundancy inside. There is redundancy between the units. There is power redundancy. There is a lot of redundancy on top of redundancy because we want to make sure if anything goes wrong with the device or with the one of the cards, we have redundancy. Also, these firewalls, because they're in the data centers, in some cases will do remote VPN to them as well, depending on the company and size of the company. But the biggest part, they are robust firewalls with a big throughput, ideally very, very little latency that need to do quite a lot. So the redundancy part is key here. And also, because in data center, many of them will support a very high-end throughput on the connectivity perspective. 10 gig in the past, 40 gig connectivity in the past as well. These connectors by themselves can be quite expensive. So when you're shopping for the firewalls, you need to take into account the price of connectors and the cables that will connect between them as well. B2B, business-to-business firewalls are essentially enterprise firewalls, usually not very big. They are less focused on redundancy on the components and more of high availability to make them work. They are less feature rich from a perspective of next generation because we are talking to business partners, and majority of the time these firewalls usually do layer 4, so destination and source connectivity to a particular vendor. We want to make sure we are not wide open to a vendor. Some cases it's going to be over MPLS, maybe VPN, maybe some other connectivity, but we want to make sure we are creating a rule base to not expose too much to a vendor, but we also want to make sure we're not getting malware from the vendor or the partner. So in some cases, we're going to put and maybe antiviruses or threat prevention, threat protection on these firewalls to make sure the communication is not just secure, but also we're not introducing malware to our organization from somebody else. Branch firewalls or SMB firewalls. Why/SMB? Because many SMBs will use similar devices in their environment. But the difference between branch firewalls and SMB is that the branch firewalls will be a bigger part of a bigger management where I need to manage multiple firewalls. And these firewalls could be 50, 60, could be hundreds or even 1,000 firewalls. Let's say if you are a store department or pizza department, or you have multiple gas stations, for example, and then each of them going to have a small firewall to secure the communication internally, but also secure the communication to the mothership to make sure that the hub and spoke communication is there. And I think it's a good time to talk about what's changing in this industry. A lot of the time, majority of the communications in the banks as well, it's a good example, were hub and spoke. I have a branch, and there's a device there that need to communicate back to the mothership, back to the data center to get the information they need, but also to get to the internet. We see quite a big shift in the industry moving from MPLS to, first of all, to SD-WAN, but also from hub and spoke to get to the internet to the ideas that we are getting directly to the internet. So the communications that need to go to the data center will be done over SD-WAN, but the communications that need to go to the internet will actually go directly from the branch to the internet, and it will change some of the inspection points. We may see a device on the firewall that's capable to do SD-WAN, also internal firewalling, but the outgoing inspection will be done in the cloud. If any of you joined any of our seasons at the Security Architecture Podcast, Season 1 and Season 2, we actually spoke quite a lot about Secure Service Edge, and now called SASE. But this is the part where I am inspecting the communication to the internet, doing my URL filtering, DLP, and many other things already in the cloud. Very, very big movement of outbound security that if you're not familiar with, I'll suggest to look and watch. Just an example, when I work from home, work from anywhere, including an office, I'm going to have different parts here, different inspection points as well to review the traffic, to inspect the traffic, and make sure I can secure it. This is majority of the time we're talking about communication from a device or from the office towards the internet. Also, there's a small part about ZTNA, the zero trust access from home to the work, but I don't want to focus on this too much right now. I covered this quite a lot from other presentations. Let's talk about internal firewalls. As I mentioned right now, in a branch, I may have a firewall that need to secure communication internally, but also in the data center or headquarters, I'm going to have different departments when I want to secure the communications there. You probably heard about the term, oh, we want to have zero trust, we want to have a segmentation. How do I segment? If I have a layer 3 router internally, or layer 3 switch, correctly says, I'm going to route the traffic from ACLs. I'm going to have limited capability in what I can do. That's why the firewalls come in, what can help me segment the information internally and be much more proactive to tell who can access there and where. Remember the user identification part? It's critical here. I want to only allow Evgeny or Scott access to a particular part as well. But what happened if I need to secure communication inside a segment? This is where micro-segmentation comes in. I'm talking about on the same level way of controls. And there's a couple of approaches here. Certain companies like VMware, for example, they have their own way to do it on a virtual part. But there's other companies that also can do it using endpoint solution on the servers, where they map the connectivity and understand what kind of connections servers need to do to their users, but also internally. Maybe it's a database server to application server or vice versa. It's a very rising field of our industry. We have several vendors there as well, and this is the way, the journey to zero trust. Micro-segmentation is part of it. This is why I call it journey, because it's a journey. You're not actually stopped. There's always something to do, but also important part of the bigger firewall segment. And the last one here is the endpoint firewalls. Many companies in the EPP space, CrowdStrike is one of them, for example, have a firewall on their endpoint solution, and I think CrowdStrike in their case have a firewall as well on a server as well to protect who can and how can connect to the firewall, to the endpoint. Oh, forgot one, sorry. Public cloud, I mentioned this in the beginning. AWS, Azure, and GCP, all of them have different security groups to communicate and control the traffic internally and who can connect to them. In a way, they are firewalls, just called differently. And you may think about this, if it's all these different components, is there a better way to manage them, or what do I need to think about it? So if I bring the first slide in the beginning, here, you will see that with so many different firewalls, the management component is also important. Can I manage them from one place? If I use one vendor, for example, can I manage them in one location? Or maybe I use a specifically design vendor. There are like 3-4 of them, like Tafin, AlgoSec, Firemont, Skybox, that are designed to help with firewall management, where they can aggregate the understanding and the traffic flow between all these different firewalls, including the cloud, to show you as a user, as a practitioner in the firewall space, what's happening with the firewalls, what is the changes that happened, how's my compliance, does anybody create an open risky port to the internet, like Telnet, for example, or SSH? And it's all very, very important components. And some of the things you want to think about it when you have a management, and it's not just the vendor, but also the other one, like the Tafin, what I can do. Do I have a centralized management? So let's just kind of centralize on one vendor. I'm buying a firewall vendor, and I have many, many different locations. I want to understand what's my support, what's my reporting. Can I create access to different people that will have different ways? And I want to make sure maybe it's not going to change things I don't want it to change. Can I create firewall templates every time I add a new office? I don't need to create a rule base because I'm going to have a template already that all my offices will look like. Maybe I will create 3-tier approach, small, medium, large, and every time I add an office, I decide what kind of template you're going to have there, and automatically going to assign a template back to have a clean rule base, back to understand what's happening. And all this will actually help you in case you want to migrate to a different vendor to have a clean policy to move easier. We definitely want to have a good backups and restore because firewall is a hardware, sometimes they die. We want to make sure we can restore the firewall as quickly as possible to make sure the traffic is flowing back in case we don't have redundancy. And back to metrics. Okay, let's go and talk about example of buying a new firewall. This is the metrics we created for the metrics and a kind of a framework of 5 steps: business alignment, trust advisor, market research, POC, and procurement. And I'm going to stop here for a second to let you look, but I'm going to walk you on this example when I'm buying a new firewall. What are the things I want to think about it? Because if you're going to stick to this process, you will be successful and happy camper. So let's start first one, business alignment. What is my business goal? Fundamentally, I need a device that will secure my inline traffic. What are the potential use cases? I actually need to create use cases. This is very important because when I have use cases and when I'm POCing them, I can have success for the use cases. So you want to create your use cases first and understand this part. Later on, we're going to add more use cases that can help us as well. But you need to start from something. You want to look on the business model, on the pricing. You want to understand how hard it's going to be to replace my current solutions. Because if I have a humongous rule list, like 4,000 rules, how long will it take me to move them? How do I know I actually use all these rules? All this come into the account when you change firewall vendors, because fundamentally, majority of us have firewalls. I don't think I have a customer that don't have a firewall. People are afraid to move from vendor to vendor. It doesn't mean it's not possible, but it does require a lot of planning. This is the last one, cost of moving to a new technology. Then the second part, trusted advisor. Don't do everything by yourself. Find somebody you trust, Gartner, Forrester, Boutique Analytics, VAR, MSSPs, somebody that help you with the journey to understand what you're going to do. Because as much as vendors want to help, in the end of the day, vendors want to sell their technology. So they probably will say yes for everything, but it doesn't mean that they will actually able to deliver. So you want a second pair of eyes. You want somebody that you trust that will understand and will able to potentially dispute, understand the vendor claim to make sure they align to your needs. Also, the trust advisors will be the people that are going to help you with use case enrichment. What else can you do? What else you need to think about it that potentially you didn't think? And they're going to help you with the vendor selection as well. So you're not going to choose the vendor for you full time. It's your responsibility in the end, but they're definitely going to help you to narrow the search and understand, to show you the pros and cons. And personally, I believe it's also important to show you synergy, how a particular vendor can work with other vendors in your ecosystem. Next one is the market research. Now we're going to pricing, understanding how much it's going to cost. As I mentioned before, basically device size means bandwidth, and then we're adding multiple things. We also want to understand the ROI for the firewall, and going to help us with maturity and governance. So we're kind of narrowing to the point when we get into the POC. In a POC, majority of cases, you're going to have 2, maybe 3 vendors. And this is where we take our use cases and create a success criteria, and ideally we score them. So for example, when I mentioned about the descendant firewalls, I spoke about stress testing or SSL decryption. If I decrypt traffic and I know the performance of the firewall will degrade, how would I know? I can of course trust the vendor, but I can also understand my footprint of traffic, understand what kind of traffic I have in my environment, to the point when I can record a traffic in my environment and then replay this traffic through load testing tools to understand how a particular firewall will act in my environment. It's done. It's possible. I did it for universities, for banks, and many other customers. You're going to have a true scenario. Now, if you're buying a one firewall, maybe no point to do it. But if you're buying a massive enterprise firewall, they're going to cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars or maybe even millions. Is definitely something you want to do. Or you may ask the vendor to simulate and show you the numbers as well. So you create these cards as scores, and every time you check something, you give it a score. This way, you're going to have a systematic approach to understand how to score a vendor, and later on how to talk about pricing as well in case they are missing on some of the points. You also always want to have another vendor to make sure in case the first vendor has failed that you can go back to the second vendor and not start the process from scratch, because it's going to be time consuming, and time consuming in some cases mean money, a lot of money, because if you need to move from a vendor, you may need to pay more money for support. And the last one here is definitely onboarding. We need to understand how long it will take, and you may see ease of policy move is in bold, because moving policy from a vendor to a different vendor is hard. It's not straightforward. All of them have tools, but you need to understand how well these tools are working. And of course, buying the device or the hardware, the software. 1 to 3 years support. There's different models here that will help you to minimize the effort. The longer the support you're buying, usually the cheaper the price will be for certain components. And then you have an add-ons from it, how it's going to work, and definitely the support part. You want to understand SLA. You want to understand when you call the support, how fast you get answers. Are they in your geographical region? Are you support 9 to 5 or 24/7? Guess what? When you're doing changes on the firewall, you usually do them during the night. So if it's a night in North America or in Europe and you have a problem, who are you going to call? Ghostbusters? You want to call the support. So this part are important. And if you have a failure and you need a new device, what is your support? Is it next business days? Is it 4 hours? And don't forget, next business day in some cases mean it ships. But if you're in a different country and they don't have a stock in the country, for example, I'm in Canada. In some cases, the devices came from the United States and may get stuck in custom. Even so it got shipped, next business day, it still didn't arrive in next business day because it got stuck in custom. They cannot pretty much do anything with it. So all these important parts are important. That's why the support is fundamental as well, how we build it. And it may determine next business day, 4 hours or high availability will help you to decide what to buy. If you want high availability or do you want faster support, or you're going to get high availability on the hardware, but then you got next business day because you already have a device that you have working. Some add-ons like training, dedicated resources, also important. You want to make sure that your staff understand how to work with the technology, how to operate this particular technology, to make sure they will be happy to work with this and not going to struggle to understand how to make change policy to troubleshooting. That's it. Hope it helped you understand how to do POC. Success criteria is the key. Metrics. What do I care? And why do I care? I purchase a device. We all make mistakes sometimes, and maybe not. But I want to purchase a device and start collecting metrics to understand later on if I made the correct choice. Or when I buy a next device for my branch or my data center, do I need a bigger one or a smaller one? By collecting performance information, downtime, why did downtime happen, failover, and other thing, it may help me understand. Now, failover is a medicine of metrics. In my mind, it is, because what you metric in failover is the time it failed over, is the latency or the amount of traffic was lost. And if you see these metrics are changing, it means you're doing something wrong, because you want it to be consistent when you do failover testing. And please, you have to do failover testing. You have to do DR testing, because if you put a lot of money in redundancy, and you're not checking the redundancy, there's no point to do this. What else here? Network latency. We want to have a device, but we want to understand what kind of latency the device introduces. There is no magic. If you need to do inspection on the packets it's going to introduce some latency, maybe nanoseconds, maybe microseconds, but we want to understand what it is. So periodically checking the latency through the firewall between different networks will help me understand if my firewall is staying consistent. And if it falls down, then why? Like, we don't want a gap of 3 years when we just introduce a firewall and then check it 3 years later, because you're not going to be able to understand what happened that did the degradation of the network or the throughput utilization. The last one is also important, because if my pipe to the internet is 10 gig or 1 gig or 100 meg or whatever it is, I want to understand if I'm going to the point where I consume my throughput and now I need to upgrade my internet, and I want to do it not when I'm on 90% consumption, when I'm probably at 60 or 70 to start planning. That's it. It was very interesting to present. I have a lot of information more about the firewalls. I can probably talk for 4 or 5 hours. There are so many different components under the firewall, and every component into the firewall can actually take an hour to talk, because we didn't talk about DLP, we didn't talk about DNS security, just the clustering itself. It's so fascinating as well. So happy to be here. Looking forward for the questions, and if you have anything else to ask me. Thank you.
All right, great presentation. Yeah, and Evgeny, are you ready for some questions?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Yeah, so I guess the first thing I wanted to say is, I appreciate the historical perspective, and I was just wondering, with your long experience with firewalls, you talked about performance, and you held up your Android phone there to show how much more power is available now than back in the day. Is the processing capacity on the firewalls, outstripping the traffic demand on them, or is it the other way around, or have they advanced in parallel?
They definitely advance in parallel. We have a faster internet, we have a faster cables, we have a faster chipsets. So the firewall demand is aligned with the demand there as well. Of course, the more throughput you need, the more components you need, and it's most of the cases going to be more expensive to buy such firewall.
Right. Okay. And you talked a lot about the add-ons, and as those go, things like the SSL and things like that. What are sort of the most costly add-ons in terms of the performance trade-offs that you have to watch the most closely as you sort of flip them on?
That's a good question. It's a combination. Definitely, to decrypt SSL is not even an add-on. It's almost a table step. You have to do it. But the
Gotcha.
ones that take a lot of resources is going to be the IPS perspective, the intrusion prevention part. In some cases, SSL, VPN, the remote access may take as well, because you need to understand a lot. And again, the decryption and encryption part take a lot of heavy lifting on the firewalls. In some cases, certain firewalls on a higher scale will have a dedicated chipset for decryption and encryption as well to help you do this work. So this is what you want to watch and understand what you're going to do with this firewall. But probably from performance hit is the IPS part, because you need to understand the packet, go do deep inspection to understand what's happening there.
Gotcha. Okay, great. You were talking a little bit about, sort of the complex modern network environment, where defending the old on-premises castle and moat has become a much smaller component of the infrastructure with so many resources in public clouds and in SaaS applications. What are some of the top ways that you've seen firewalls sort of cause, maybe unexpected configuration or performance problems among company resources due to that complexity?
Sorry, can you repeat? Is the configuration cost a problem, or what cost a problem?
Yeah, well, whether it's configuration or performance, are there sort of unique problems that are coming up now when people sort of turn on a new firewall? That are sort of
Yeah, there's
problem.
a lot of components that can happen. It could be certain traffic that the firewall may don't understand, even so firewall been around for a long time. Back in the days, there was quite a lot of issues with VoIP traffic, for example. because it was a unique way how the web will work and how connection will terminate. Right now, in some cases, if you try to, let's go back to SSL VPN, for example, SSL decryption. If you try to open SSL, certain traffic is not possible to decrypt because it has a PIN certificate. And you may actually degrade certain traffic or block traffic because the firewall will block encrypted traffic because you cannot decrypt it and to just drop it. Or many cases could be with you have an AV, EDR, EPP solution on-prem that wants to communicate back with the mothership, and the firewall will not be able to decrypt this traffic and just drop the traffic. So in some cases, you will need to do exclusions for SSL decryption for such applications. So it's not like a one single problem, but it's definitely a good idea to understand your applications, to do monitoring before you decrypt the traffic. This is one
Gotcha.
part.
Gotcha.
Also, in some cases, we saw a lot of connections, like torrent connections, for example, or the type of traffic you do. Gaming is a good example. If a company is a gaming company and it has gaming service, there's a quite unique pattern of the connections that may generate a lot of connections in a very small amount of time.
Super. Gotcha. Thank you. We got a comment here from Greg saying great information. Thanks for letting us know, Greg. It's always good to hear. We have a question here from Jonathan too. He's asking, is it better to run a single firewall that's got a lot of CPU for multiple firewall services, or to get multiple firewalls that may do, have separate functions?
So let's separate this question. It's a very good question. If you have multiple needs, first of all, you don't want to run one firewall, you want to always run them in a cluster pair. Now, having said this, you can run virtual firewalls inside the firewalls. Different companies call them differently, like Fortinet calls them VDOMs, for example. Checkpoint calls them virtual systems, and Palo as well, it's similar. From my perspective, it's more about a cost application, because if you buy a bigger firewall and you can chunk them to different firewalls, you're going to have an easier management of them, and you're probably gonna pay less versus buying different firewalls. But then you have a problems with maintenance. What happens if you need to reboot the firewall, or you need to do an upgrade on the firewall? It will really depend on the type of traffic that's running through this firewall. And if this traffic is not critically important for the business, that you cannot never bring it down, then I see no problem. And I'll recommend personally, like with the knowledge I have right now, to do virtual firewalls on one firewall. But if you're concerned about availability, if you're concerned about be as less entity as possible, you may want dedicated firewall. So you want to understand the type of traffic and the type of communication you're going to have through this firewall.
All right, great. Thanks. And thanks, Jonathan, for that question. You talked a lot about elements of modern firewalls, and I'm wondering, are there any elements that, people maybe aren't using yet, but that have a lot of potential, or, not using a lot yet, but that maybe have a lot of potential to improve the security of their corporate resources?
Can you repeat?
Yeah, sort of like, I'm wondering about like nascent features, like some of the features that are newer, that are pretty innovative, that maybe don't have a lot of adoption yet, but you think really have a lot of potential.
So DNS security, not like as new, but relatively new for the firewall space, maybe like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
It basically can block DNS requests if you're going into malicious sites. We now see much more AI and ML to understand type of traffic and have the adoption as well for this perspective. We definitely see the idea of taking the security control from on-prem firewall to the cloud in some cases. These parts come as well. We now see firewalls doing SD-WAN, so it's much more mature on the routing protocols as well. So they're going to be the sum that I'm thinking of them as of right now.
Yeah, no, those are fantastic. All right. Well, Evgeny, I know you've got to go. I think we're going to have to leave it there. But anything that you want to tell our audience about your podcast? Any interesting interviews or sessions lately
Yes,
that you'd like to
definitely.
point to?
Thank you. So our seasons 4 right now, as part of Security Architecture podcast, we're covering a quite interesting space called browser isolation and browser security. People may have heard about new companies like Talon, Island, Menlo, Zscaler, of course, not so new. So it's an interesting space that complement to the firewalls space in my mind. So definitely have a look, go to the website. I actually going to start another podcast soon, so more details to come eventually. But definitely find me on LinkedIn, find the podcast. If you have questions, I'll be happy to learn from you and know more about you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Evgeny, thank you so much. This was a really informative presentation, and appreciate all your insights here in the Q&A as well.
Awesome.
All right, and before we wrap up, we have one more piece of business. It's the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing, and the winner of the card today is Matt Fullerton from California. So congratulations to Matt. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the ActualTech Media team, I do want to thank our sponsor, CrowdStrike, for making this event possible, and thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day and a fantastic weekend.